Money has always had the power to shape the world. But who actually decides what gets built, what gets protected, and what gets left behind? Welcome to another episode of the FinFact Hub, where finance is the tool and impact is the purpose. Our guest today has spent over 2 decades moving between banking, fintech, governance, and insurance. Not chasing titles, but chasing impact. She currently serves as Head of Sustainability and Information Governance at Zurich International Life Middle East, also a member of DIFC's Sustainable Finance Working Group, and a mentor for the next generation of women in finance and sustainability through Wiser by Mustard. But long before the boardrooms and the frameworks, her entry into this world was through a project that aimed to give financial access to those who had none. And that gives you everything you need to know about the way that she thinks. Our guest today is Nadia Boumeziout. A quick note before we begin, Nadia joins us today at a personal capacity, and everything she shares today are her own personal opinions and experiences, not those of her employer. Welcome to the FinFact Hub, Nadia. I'm so excited to have you here with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm equally excited to be here.
Thank you for joining me. Let's just get straight into it. I'm going to start with the first question about to what extent do you think insurance quietly shapes what gets built, financed, and ultimately what our future looks like?
So that's a great question. Insurance is actually playing a bigger and bigger role because to me, insurance is almost a precondition to bankability. We can see a lot of cases nowadays where for big projects that are being financed, if insurance is not guaranteed or not available at the point of that financing being completed or the project being completed, the financing for the project almost falls apart because being able to insure that project is so important at the end, right? And we've seen how climate risk has brought this to the surface. It has really made this visible because climate risk, there are a lot of physical risk aspects that come with it, right? And then this needs to be factored in. So it's really worth looking at insurance as an enabler and a supporter and involving insurance companies early in the conversation because it can really be a deciding factor almost.
So let's dive a bit deeper into that, into what is actually the role of insurance in the process of financing projects, specifically impact projects. You know, for someone that might have not heard of the details before or even doesn't have a finance background, I try to make the podcast, accessible to people who don't have a finance background. Can you walk us through what that means?
So I think when we talk about impact, we need to look at what are we trying to achieve? What is the output at the end, right? And for almost any project that you will have, you will need insurance, right? Insurance is, in the end, is a risk manager, right? Insurance provides protection for certain risks that are there, right? And if you can't insure those risks or you can't quantify those risks, then how will you achieve the impact that you set out to have, right? So for me, it's almost working backwards. What is the impact you want to achieve? How are you going to finance that? And how can you ensure that the insurance company is aligned and will ultimately provide that insurance?
I had heard something on the World Bank podcast a while back about risk and insurance and how sometimes the perceived risk is much greater than the actual risk.
Oh, yes.
And that's why insurance is so important to come in to make sure that we're directing capital to the things that or the places that really do need the capital and kind of overstep that obstacle in the way, which is the perceived risk, especially in more problematic areas that are, perceived to be more problematic.
That's actually a really interesting point because that's true. And often the perceived risk seems to be much higher. And then there are facts and data that actually say this is not true. We see this a lot in the developing world, right? If we see what we call the global south, but actually in developing economies, Africa, Asia, Latin America, we hear this a lot, like the risk is too high, we can't put insurance there or even sustainable finance. But it's almost like, I don't know where they get this information from, because the facts and the data actually show the risk is not necessarily exponentially higher. I think requires a bit more homework to look into it. It's sad that the perceived risk is then letting those investors take a step back. And sometimes even development banks, who, in my opinion, should know better because they're more exposed to those countries and areas,
100%. And they would also have the research and the data more than
They
I
do.
would think than the
And
investors.
yet we talk about perceived risk. They do. They know. The risk is not necessarily higher. Often also the projects are not of an extremely high value where you would say like, oh, this can absolutely not be insured, for example. And it's not a fact. And I think this is a very valid point about perceived risk. I was sitting with large investors actually several months ago, and they were also talking about this, and they were like, yeah, but the risk is so high. And then someone else who has all the data and the research debunked that and said, where is your perception coming from? Because that's actually not true.
It's a lot of perception and expectation. We learn this, even when we study in economics and finance, the expectation plays a big role in action of consumers and investors and the economy as a whole. What do you think we can do to combat something like that?
I've learned something, that a lot of decisions are made from an emotional perspective and not necessarily based on data. I've observed this a lot in the financial sector, where it's not necessarily about here are the facts and here's the data, here's the analysis. That, yes, this will also obviously be there, but often it's someone said something and that person is perceived as having a lot of experience, and then they believe what that person says because that person has demonstrated, some success. And based on that, these decisions are made. Unfortunately, that happens,
It becomes contagious.
Yes.
That's the thing. Also, when one person has an expectation, they can also influence others, and then just becomes a whole thing. Like we see, in the developing world, it's just a much bigger perceived risk than it actually is. Do you think, from the insurance company side, that is also an obstacle? Do you think the insurance companies themselves see a bigger risk than there actually is?
Yes.
Yeah.
It cuts across all of the financial sector. I think in parts it's changing, where they see a real merit and they actually spend the time in those markets. I feel like often that's also the case with companies or people that are sitting in the developed world at their computer and have never actually visited the countries, right? I mean, if you want to really see and know about, especially a developing economy, I think it's really important that you go there.
100%.
You visit, you see actual projects on the ground, you see what's already there, you see what works and what doesn't. It's not that easy when you're sitting at your desk and only looking at some reports, right?
Statistics, yeah, 100%. You have to be on the ground, because how can you serve the people that you want to serve if you don't know them?
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. I have to go back to this. So the US Fed, I started with look at AI investments because I'm like really annoyed by it. I'm not saying don't invest in AI, but what I'm saying is trillions go into AI investment, right? Without any guaranteed returns. Nobody today can tell you there will be a return.
It's just not about risk. It's not.
Not at all.
No.
Nobody can tell you. OpenAI so far has not made any money, okay? The US Fed has flagged this in their 2026 Q1 report or something as a risk to financial stability, because it's all debt financed, right? And there's labor market disruption, right? Because companies are letting people go. Again, sustainability, right? Companies are firing people, which disrupts the labor market. This is US focused. So if the industry can deploy that scale of capital against this risk, then the idea that sustainable finance is too risky or too hard to scale doesn't hold up, right? Because we have proof that sustainable finance works. We know there are returns. AI has not promised any returns yet, right? I want to see one of the AI companies that has made money so far. So, but they're investing, right?
Yeah.
So when they say we're not investing because the risk is too high, what they're actually saying is we're not interested. It's not,
Which is very disappointing.
But if we look at the data, so we have money. We also have money for defense spending, by the way, lots of it. But we don't have money for our food.
Yeah.
And that to me, doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So all these excuses. So when you ask me, is impact important to me? Yes, more than ever,
Of course it is.
right?
Of course.
And all these excuses don't hold up,
No, they don't.
right?
Not at all.
So, I mean, it's shocking to me because sometimes it seems like we need so much money for sustainability,
yeah.
but it's actually not comparatively. I mean, look at Europe, right? With the heat wave they're currently having. They have multiple issues with this now. If every household in Europe would install air conditioning, their electricity grid would actually collapse because can't actually hold up. In Belgium, my family's in Belgium, they had to shut off the electricity grid in between because it was like everybody had their AC on. Those that had AC had it on, and it would put a strain on the electricity grid. So these are real risks we're currently facing, but we're throwing money at AI because it sounds sexy, you know? I mean, yeah, it's true, isn't it?
No, you're 100% right. It's also very much of a pet peeve of mine because this is a point that comes up a lot on the podcast and that comes up a lot in the impact world. There is 100% enough capital.
Of course there is.
You know, and this is something that everybody unanimously agrees on,
Yes.
but it's not going to the right places.
You know, it shocked me. I was at this event and they said World Bank, right?
Yeah.
IFC, or other development banks. To deploy a development loan takes 3 to 5 years.
Wow.
Like a blended finance, you know, with the due diligence, the review, and this and this. Call AI and see how quickly you get money. This to me is like makes no sense. We have small farmers that are struggling because they can't grow food, you know, food that is also meant for us.
Yes.
Particularly here, we're importing all of it. But no, the investment is going that way.
It's not being placed as a priority.
And like you said, money is there.
Yeah.
It's the choice we make with it, right? And again, it goes back to how do we make people understand? And unfortunately, in some way, sadly, they'll only understand when their life depends on it.
When things go wrong. Yeah.
I was reading a statistic today, which I have to research. Don't quote me on that, but I need to research whether that's true. In Europe, during this current heat wave that they've been having, 20,000 people have died from the heat wave.
Yeah.
And we're not looking at climate risk. I mean, it's insane.
It's still something that's not real.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
But it's there right at your doorstep.
Yeah.
France, by the way,
yeah,
your new home, really, really struggled with the heat. I don't know. We'll have to see.
Okay. I think we can talk about this forever, but I have a lot of other questions, so let's get into it. So we learned that insurance doesn't just absorb risk, but it also prices it. And in theory, that means it can influence behavior, like we just said. So do you think insurers have a responsibility to actively incentivize better decisions rather than simply protecting people from the consequences of bad ones?
I probably wouldn't call it responsibility, but I do think that they can have a focus on product design, putting more thought into the way products are designed so that they are more accessible and inclusive, right? So, and the way they can do that is by building in discounts, for example, for good behavior, or for retrofitting of buildings, or for more flood resilient infrastructure, right? So by incentivizing good behavior and building this into your product design, I think the insurance company can be a driver, let's say, much earlier on. It's a bit about the framing around that. And I also feel like better decisions have to be more affordable decisions, meaning I'm not a big fan of the green premium and the thought that a sustainable product should cost more or can cost more because the buyer would be willing to pay more for it. I actually think it should be the other way around. I think that you should be incentivized to make a better decision. It should be more affordable and more accessible for you to make a more sustainable and better decision. Now, how do we do that? well, some innovators can come up with it, right? I'm sure anything is possible, right? So looking at how do we design products so that they're actually the obvious choice, right? So I think there a bit more work could be done
The
in that
responsibility
respect.
lies more there. I'm so glad that you brought that up. Let's talk about that a bit. The green premium. So the green premium is just a more expensive green bond, right? That green bonds are more expensive than regular bonds.
Yes.
And I'm really glad that you brought that up, because we need to be incentivized to make the right decisions, like you said, especially with something like sustainability, which is just perceived to be harder or to be extra work because it hasn't always been factored in the corporate world or like financially. So I really like that point that you raised, that it should be easier, it should be more incentivized, and maybe that's where the responsibility lies, just to facilitate it and make it easier.
And also, you look at it as a system, right? So for example, let's take an example of retrofitting a building to be more flood resistant, let's say, right? You put some flood defenses around it, right? Now, obviously, that's an expense to that company, let's say, right? Then work together with companies that can provide the financing for this retrofitting bit. So then you tie everything together, right? So the financing and so on and so on. But at the end, the insurance premium should not be more, because you actually made an effort to protect this asset and make it better. That should be rewarded with a lower premium in the end. But the green premium, if we go back to that, and if I mean, you just studied that, right? You just went through your studies. The green premium, I believe, came about because it was a nice way to position it and say, actually, we can charge more because people would be willing to pay more for it.
But are they willing to pay more for it?
No. Why? And this is exactly what we need to look at. Why would a company opt for a green bond? There's a reason behind it, right? It's either because they have a framework, a sustainability framework that requires them to look at that and have a portion of their financing being green or sustainable. Or they really want to finance something that is green, and the green bond then absolutely makes sense to tie it all together. But the question is, what is the real reason behind opting for it, right? Sometimes they may be forced to do it and then have to pay and absorb the higher premium, but I don't see why it should be more expensive. I mean, obviously, someone who provides that finance will explain to you why, but I think we should work towards innovating in a way that we say, this will not cost you more. It should either be the same or less.
Yeah,
to make it more
agree.
accessible, and that it is that any company will say, this is my obvious choice.
Yeah.
I get rewarded for being green and sustainable. I will opt for this bond or sustainability linked loan or such.
100%. I don't understand that logic, why it should be more expensive, because people would just pay for it, or they'd want it more, but they don't. And I think this is an issue that we're seeing, is that there's just so much effort going into convincing people to be more sustainable, convincing companies to be more sustainable, that it should be easier than that. So I feel like it's a reverse logic where, like, oh no, they're going to want it anyway, so it should be more expensive.
Yeah, and this is a very good point about the convincing, by the way. I've thought about this, I've thought about, are we not saying it right? Are we not communicating it right? Is there something that we should say that makes it more obvious? And what I came down to is, no, it's actually, we need to incentivize the better option, right? The more sustainable option, the greener option. I think if the product is made in a way that it incentivizes that good behavior, then you drive it towards that, right?
100%.
Because most companies will still make decisions based on the finances around it.
100%. But I think the way that they're making decisions now is because it's easier, like you said. It is the easier option. It's what everybody's used to. But like you said, if these sustainable options and decisions are facilitated and made easier, and made it the obvious option, it could be chosen just as easily.
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
I wish I had a simpler answer for
No,
this, but
no, I don't think there is any question or any kind of topic that we talk on here that has a simple. Like I wish there was just one answer to a question like this, and how we can solve world hunger. Like 1, 2, 3, done.
Well,
but
on that note, I think it's possible. I think it's a question of will, not whether it's possible.
No, it's definitely not a conversation of whether it's possible or not, but I wish it was an easier answer.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Um, but I wanted to go back and talk about sustainability and what we were talking about and how we're convincing people to be more sustainable. What does that mean to you? What is sustainability? What does someone being more sustainable or a company being more sustainable look like?
So for me, sustainability goes back to the 17 SDGs. To me, it's about the Sustainable Development Goals, which ultimately bring about fairness and social equity. It's not just about emissions and carbon, calculating your carbon profile and so on. For me, it's about the whole of society, the whole of the world being in a better position. So all of this is connected. These are all systems, right? So sustainability for me is more than just metrics. And for me, it's long term. I don't have any expectations that we can achieve this in 1 or 2 years. This is a very long term plan. But to me, sustainability is really more holistic, not just about emissions and environment. For me, actually, at the center is people.
100%.
And if we put people at the center, then everything connects to it. Everything around it actually will be aligned, including environment and planet and emissions.
100%. And we're so aligned because that was my next question.
Oh, there we go.
That was exactly my next question, is that I think now when people hear sustainability, they think carbon emissions, environment, which is definitely very important, should be a priority. But sustainability doesn't stop there. Like you said, people have to be at the forefront of that, and then everything else will be aligned. You know, when I was talking to Jessica, we were talking about this, how I don't think there's anybody who doesn't want a fair, just world. You know,
exactly.
but we ignore these kind of goals and these sustainability goals, which are all a part of sustainability, past ESG, past carbon emissions, past all of these things. So environment is important, but we have to look at the whole picture. And so my question was, well, do you think we've become too narrow in how we define sustainable finance?
Yeah.
And what your definition should be, which you've already touched on.
Yeah.
And I'd love to go deeper as well into financial inclusion, specifically about in talking about the definition of sustainability, which is also a big part.
Yeah, so absolutely. I think we've become too narrow, because if we look at only emissions and ESG scores and base our financing decisions only on those two metrics, it almost feels like we're aligning it to our annual report, because it's very short-term thinking, right? And if you only look at those two metrics, I don't think we're covering everything else, right? So I think we need to go beyond that. And sustainability, as I said, much more holistic. For me, governance is also very important. Governance to me is the glue that keeps it all together, but also helps you to plan a bit more long term. It's about affordability, accessibility, financial inclusion. We can't exclude a large portion of the world and say we're into sustainable finance. I think that view has been too narrow. But I also understand that we needed a starting point, right? So I think if something that is easily measurable, like emissions and maybe an ESG score, which can also vary, but at least you have some metrics that can give you some idea of the performance of that company, can help, but it shouldn't stop there. We need to expand beyond that and really look at a much broader picture, and also go from just short-term thinking and short-term returns to long-term. And that may mean that in year one, you're not going to have that profit that you set out to have, right? But then that's a corporate decision that has to be made if we're serious about it. And yes, so finance and the financial sector has been optimized for quick returns, right? We're looking at short-term gains. We're 100%. Looking at quarter by quarter, end of the year. And we need a much more forward-looking perspective, right? Much broader. And I feel like in some ways, some companies and countries are certainly going in that direction, but there's still a lot of work to be done.
I agree. I think there's still a long way to go. But like you said, maybe, ESG scores and these like the metrics that have been introduced are a good way to get started, because they speak the language of corporate and the numbers, and something that you can track and something that you can follow. And maybe that can be our entryway. But I agree. I think there's still a long way to go. What kind of new introductions do you see happening in the corporate world or in the world in general to move towards sustainability in this broader definition?
New introduction in finance. I mean, we do see new products coming in, new approaches. I think in some ways also some crisis may push you in that direction and may drive that forward. Unfortunately, sometimes bad things need to happen so that good things can come out of it.
That's an interesting point, yeah.
In the insurance space, I see a lot of innovation around parametric insurance, which is it's an insurance product that actually pays out at a predefined trigger.
Okay.
So, regular insurance works. You pay a premium, and then when something happens, you file a claim. Somebody will assess that claim and eventually pay out. This process can be very long. I mean, months sometimes, right? And that's not really helping, especially, let's say, smaller companies or, develop in the developing world. So parametric insurance is set up in a way that you predefine a trigger. That could be, for example, X millimeters of rainfall. When that is reached, a certain amount is paid out. And that's particularly interesting for smallholder farmers, for example, right? Or prolonged droughts. There could be a trigger that says if a drought prolongs beyond X number of days, the insurance pays out a certain amount of money, and that actually helps them recover much faster. So there are those product innovations that we see, but more is possible, right? We can always do more.
For sure. What do you think that would look like? What is more? Do you have
in insurance or overall in finance?
Overall, but I know you're into insurance. So if there's a specific maybe product development or improvement that you see, we can also touch on that.
So I think overall in finance, there could be more collaboration. So something that I feel like is very valuable, particularly for development finance, is blended finance, where you get public funding, you crowd in some private capital, and even insurance companies can be part of it. Insurance can be a great vehicle to de-risk a financing and project. So collaborating more, like bringing multiple actors together that can carry a different level of risk. With that also, it makes it less risky for the private sector to come in. So having those kind of finance vehicles, I think, can be very valuable. And I think in the market like here, it's a lot about education as well, right? I mean, it shouldn't just be slapping a label of sustainable on there. It should be intentional. What are we trying to achieve? What is the impact we want to have? Why are we choosing this type of finance? And what are we aiming for going forward, right?
Very accurate, 100%. Like you said, it's not just slapping the label, which I think, into this introduction or movement into more sustainable or sustainability in general, I think a lot of companies have been doing that. We're just doing this just to tick it off, just to say that we're sustainable. But I 100% agree. I think collaboration is also very important in blended finance. It's something I'm looking to dive deeper into on the podcast later. But I wanted to dive deeper into financial inclusion. So you spoke about that before, that financial inclusion is something that is crucial, and it shaped your experience in your sustainability journey. So why do you think access to financial services remains such a fundamental part of sustainable development? And what can we do to get closer to that goal? This is a topic very close to my heart, financial inclusion.
I'm deeply passionate about financial inclusion because I feel like everybody should have access to financial tools, right? And if you think about it this way, a household or a business that doesn't have access to finance does not have any shock absorber. If a crisis happens, they have no way to recovery. It can be detrimental to them. So providing finance, savings tool, insurance, credit can be a life changer to these people, right? And too many people are still left out of the financial sector, right? So for me, and it's all doable. Like the difference is that they're usually bigger audiences. It's more volumes. And many financial institutions for them, it's too big of an administrative task, right, to cater to all of them. But there are solutions that are working well already around the world, and I think they could scale even further. I think it's super important. Financial inclusion, to me, can make a real difference to people. I mean, think about it. Think about a smallholder farmer, like a small farm. I'm very passionate about farming as well, by the way. I'll talk about farming a lot. But think about a smallholder farmer that doesn't have access to finance or insurance. And there is a drought and he doesn't have his harvest. That means his entire annual income is gone and he has no way to recover that. 100%. And then for the next year, how will he buy seeds? Where will he get this from? Because there's nothing to fall back on. So I really, and these are, think about smallholder farmers. Smallholder farmers are actually responsible for about a third of global food supply. So think about the small farmer that people often don't waste a thought on, that can't grow something this year, right? But they're all contributing to our food supply.
100%.
So if we neglect them and we don't provide them with access to finance, then that their livelihood is at risk. And ultimately ours, because
100%.
we don't get our food either, right? So
they're the backbone of our economy, but they're not viewed that way, and they're not treated that way, and they're not treated or given the same opportunities and liberties.
Exactly. So I think it's also for companies to look downstream into their supply chain, right? A lot of them have small companies in their supply chain. If you neglect them, that will have an impact on your business as well. So
100%.
For me, that's also part of financial inclusion, right?
100%. And like you said earlier, collaboration is important because we are all connected ultimately, like you said. And it goes, the smallholder is always a part of the supply chain. And it doesn't just stop at farmers. All these people who don't have financial access, we're all connected in that way.
Yes.
You know, there's a statistic that I say almost every episode on the podcast, because when I first heard it, it just blew my mind. A bit over 10 years ago, 50% of the world's adult population was unbanked. This is a World Bank statistic. 50% is an insane number. Now, over the years, that number has started to go down, but there's still a long way to go, as with many other things. But, you know, a statistic like that just put things into perspective for you and helps us realize how much, like you said, how much lives are at stake, how many lives are at stake, and how much their livelihood is at stake in case of any type of crisis. So what do you think can be done to continue to make that number go down, that percentage, to have more access?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. Yeah, I think that's it's a shocking statistic, and I don't think it has changed much, by the way, since then. But what I think is interesting is also to see how other industries tap into this, right? So for me, always, like a guiding light for me was always M-Pesa in Kenya. M-Pesa was started by a telecommunication company, not by a bank, not by a financial institution. They saw a gap. They also knew they have access to a very large audience, right, through mobile phones. And they started this. M-Pesa today is so tremendously successful and has changed people's lives.
Yes. 100%.
Really, literally changed people's lives and is being copied around the world. So I also encourage other industries, look into this. Why are we waiting for banks to pick this up, right? Any industry could do something like that. And that to me is, for example, a great example of bridging that gap and bringing about that change. And they have made a change. And they're doing well. Like, it's
very well. M-Pesa is one of my favorite case studies.
Yes.
I think it's a genius idea.
Yes.
And, you know, I think it's one of these things where it's so genius that when it happens, I kind of thought, why was this not thought of before? Like, why was this not done before? And like you said, it's being copied now. My first episode on the podcast was about M-Pesa. A part of it was about M-Pesa and, you know, providing financial access to those who don't have it. And since then, even it's continuing to grow. It's moved across Africa. Several countries have it. And like you said, even outside of Africa, it's being copied. I recently heard of Bcash, I think it's called. Yeah. So that's also something so similar structure in other countries. I think in more
Yes.
Asian countries. So I love the concept of M-Pesa, and like you said, we don't have to wait for banks or the big government organizations to organize something like
Mm.
this, but the private sector can come in and do it, and can be even more successful sometimes.
And M-Pesa is also a great case study that shows you that innovation can happen in the country itself.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need people to come from the developed world and dictate to them what they should be doing,
That's a
right?
very good point. Yeah.
They developed it themselves, right? It's not, and that to me is also so valuable. And this is a case study that should be carried around the developed world to tell them you can do this yourself, right? Um, I mean, another great example for me is Grameen Bank in Bangladesh,
Mm-hmm.
coming up with micro loans, right? And they have evidence that most of them are paid back, and even like, because always there's this, yeah, they're high risk and if they can't pay back. But what are we talking about? We're talking about small ticket items,
Mm-hmm.
right? And
Mm-hmm.
even if you have a few defaults, in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to break the bank, literally,
100%.
right?
The
So
biggest commercial banks have defaults. Like, it's not
I
something
mean,
that's an obstacle.
I've worked in banking.
Yeah.
They have big defaults, and we talk about hundreds of millions of dollar
100%.
defaults. So the question is, why can't we have more of that?
Mm-hmm.
But again, it doesn't have to be a bank,
Mm-hmm.
right? We have case studies that show that it's possible.
And
right?
even sometimes they're more successful than
Yes.
a traditional bank, because we have to look at the environment and the infrastructure available and what will work for that. That's why I think M-Pesa was very successful as well, because it worked in the most rural villages as well. So
Exactly.
these people who lived in a lot of the rural areas of their countries, they didn't have access to a bank. And even if a bank opened, it wasn't going to open in every place. It just makes more sense for M-Pesa because it's more widespread. It was
Yeah.
more accessible.
Yes, and they had a network, right? They have a
Yeah.
network of like agents.
They had
and
the
so on.
infrastructure for
Exactly.
it.
So
Exactly.
they're like small places, and it worked on a regular old phone that doesn't need to be a smartphone,
Uh-huh.
because they use that kind of technology, and you can have digital payments. I mean, yes. I mean, to me, that proves that it's possible, right? So
100%.
yeah.
It was the definition of accessible, I think.
Yes. But also this leads me back to when we talk about financial inclusion. It's a little pet peeve of mine. Financial inclusion can actually be commercially viable. It doesn't have to be CSR or philanthropy, right? Let's look beyond that. We can actually make, as M-Pesa did, a commercial case for it. Because sometimes, it's seen as, it's a social exercise or something. But no, it can be commercially viable, right?
100%. And I think, sometimes the commercially viable aspect is important to push the private sector towards it. Or
Yes.
even the government, honestly.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it
public
goes back to
sector.
what you said in the beginning. We should ask the question of, why are you not considering it? And does it go back to perceived risk or real risk, right?
Yeah, 100%. Okay, you've worked across banking, fintech, governance, and now insurance. And looking across that journey, where do you think the finance industry has had the greatest opportunity to create meaningful impact? And over the next decade, specifically, where do you think it's still falling short?
Biggest opportunity to me is to really embed sustainability into your core corporate strategy.
Okay.
So not just have it as a department on the side, but really embed it, and meaning involve all the key functions. So finance, risk, procurement, all of these functions, it should embed sustainability within their core strategy and not have it as an add-on, because if it's only an add-on, it will not be given the same priorities as other BAU activities possibly, right? So embedding it completely so that it becomes part of your core and it's just part of the way you do business, right?
So what does that look like? So for a business to have sustainability at its core, does that look like giving back, or to the way that they do their operations, their investments maybe? What does that look like?
For me, it looks like, for example, the finance department reports their financial data every year, they should also be reporting non-financial data, meaning ESG and sustainability related data. Why? Because then they can make a direct link between those, and it's not seen as something the sustainability department does. When the finance people actually understand the value that is hidden within those sustainability metrics, right, and potential cost saving opportunities even, it has a whole different weight. When we look at the risk department, climate risk should be part of their overall risk framework, right? They look at this risk, and then also climate risk should be there, right? Within that framework, not as a separate focus area that somebody else may look at, right? Within procurement should look at their supply chain, right? What is hidden within the supply chain. Many procurement departments have no idea what's hidden within their supply chain. And that to me includes potential human rights and labor rights abuses. Do you have any company within your supply chain that may be violating something, right? That might be an aspect they've never looked at because it's not part of their core. Procurement department looks at cost, right? They get 3 quotes, they'll take the cheapest. But what if we looked beyond that and make it part of your screening process, right? So embedding this within the entire organization, I think, can make a meaningful difference. And I think that's where I see the opportunity, because then it's better understood within the company. If sustainability people are the only ones that are driving this narrative, and we go back to what you said earlier about are we communicating this right? My experience has been there's only so much you can do, right? So that's where I see the biggest opportunity. Where I do see some shortfall is, as long as we look at capital, or as long as we allocate capital to whoever generates the fastest and most visible returns, we're not thinking sustainability, right? So quick returns, those audiences that give us the fastest and quickest returns, may or may not, but if that's our core metric, then that's where we fall a little short. And what I also see is that the industry typically overserves the high net worth individuals and underserves vulnerable communities. So maybe looking at balancing this out a little bit, right? We were talking about underbanked people. I think a lot of high net worth individuals are a bit overbanked, maybe. So we could bring in a bit more balance there.
We need to introduce that, the new word, overbanked.
I mean, they get a lot of attention, right?
Yeah.
And I get it. I understand why. And I'm not saying don't give them attention. What I'm saying is also give attention to other audiences, right?
100%.
And balance it out. And then I think we're looking at a more holistic approach. Another thing that I always like to bring up is, and that goes back to me saying embedding it into the corporate strategy, we have another structural issue where sustainability often sits in marketing and comms. And if it sits there, it will not be seen as a strategic initiative, right?
Very good point.
So we need to lift it out of there, and it needs to sit somewhere higher up with CEO visibility, so that it gets the right attention and can be driven within the core strategy. Right?
But maybe not even moved out of marketing, just like you said, made more core so that it's within the entire organization.
No, I think it needs to be moved
Really?
out.
Why?
Yes.
Why do you think so?
Because if it stays in marketing, it's all about narrative creation.
Okay.
Right?
But don't you think narrative creation is also important?
They can do that part.
Yeah.
But it shouldn't, the function as such should not sit there. Because if it sits there, the priority will be given to narrative creation, which then also leans into greenwashing. So sometimes. So I think we need to elevate it out of there. Marketing and comms still has a role to play. I'm not saying they don't have a role to play, but I don't think this is the right place to
for the decisions to be made there.
Yes,
I agree.
And for the strategic framework and the outlook and how to embed it within other functions.
The long term.
Yes.
100%.
Yes.
Over the course of your career so far, you've worked. We've talked that you've worked across, banking and fintech and insurance. Do you think that the way that you've viewed impact has changed over time?
I think it has grown.
Okay.
So I I feel like the longer I work in the financial sector, the stronger I believe we need to think about impact. Because when in the financial sector, often decisions are made that they look at returns, they don't look at impact. And sometimes they don't know what impact means, right? So I think bringing that to the attention is becoming more and more important to me personally, right? So I feel like I need to even more focus on that. And you mentioned Jessica earlier. I think we're very much aligned in that. We need to break through some of those traditional narratives and the way we used to look at finance, you know. Again, it's about the finance sector optimizes for quick returns. And quick returns are not necessarily impact. They could be, but in many cases they're not, right? So how can we shift that? How can we make a difference? And I'm still hopeful. I mean, I'm optimistic. I still feel like something can be done. So we need to look at within capital, when we allocate capital, who gets served first? Who gets most attention? Why do they get more attention?
Who should get most attention?
Well, everybody should get some attention. And I think, how can we make sure that unbanked populations get attention, right? How can we bring this in and serve them as well? And for me, also in the past, I mentioned this earlier, but I always thought it's a communication problem. You know, it's like maybe we're not explaining it right. Maybe we're not saying the right words. Maybe they think I'm a tree hugger. And, you know, and unfortunately, some climate activists have not been helping the cause because with some of the drastic measures that they do, I think, and I always thought like maybe we need to speak better, tell a better story or something. But what I've come to the conclusion of is, and I go back to what I mentioned earlier, is we need to look at what we incentivize. How do we incentivize and what do we incentivize? And that will then drive where the business is going. So that's important to me. What gets rewarded? That's a question. And two of my favorite words are governance. I strongly believe in governance, and inclusion should be the foundation of everything.
What type of governance? What is
so for
governance?
me, governance is putting a structure around everything and making sure that there's a follow through. Because what I also see happening with certain sustainable finance and development finance is finance is given, but nobody checks whether the money is actually used for what it was meant to be used. Now, for example, we spoke about green bonds. A green bond is very clear because it's the use of proceeds has to be used for a certain purpose, right? But there are other vehicles where that's not that clear. And there's sometimes no governance structure that makes sure that somebody checks in at different milestones and makes sure that the projects are doing what they're supposed to be doing, the finance is flowing in the right direction, it's utilized for the right purposes. So for me, governance is that. It's also around having policies in place, and within organizations and financial institutions, it's also about who makes decisions. How are decisions being made? How do we make sure that it follows the right process? And it sounds a bit bureaucratic, but you know, when we look back, many of the failures with organizations were around governance issues, where governance was not followed. So I think for me, governance is the glue, and we need to have certain structures and checkpoints and holding people accountable. Governance for me is holding people accountable. Someone needs to have ownership of the decisions, and they need to be held accountable if something goes wrong. So I think that's really important.
I agree.
Right?
I agree.
And then
Creating that infrastructure,
Yes.
you know, and also setting guidelines and
Yes.
rules that facilitates it, that makes the process easier, that allows for follow through, that allows for accountability. I agree.
Also, think about it this way. Today, decisions are being made in an organization by a group of people, and there's a plan to implement. And then 3 of these people leave the organization. And then some new people come in. And then how do they know what was
Then
decided?
what happens?
Right?
Yeah.
So unless we have a governance structure in place that can stand firm no matter who's there, I think there's a risk of losing the momentum if we don't have that in place.
Do you think organizations like the World Bank play that governance role?
I think the World Bank is at a time now where they need to rethink the way they operate. I think at the time that they were founded, it all made sense, but times have changed, the world has changed, and I think particularly for development finance, there's this perceived risk we spoke about, right? So there's this perceived risk about corruption in many developing countries, right? So while development finance is given, then there's this accusation of corruption and all of this, but where's the governance structure to ensure that that cannot happen? So if the funding is given and all you care about is that it is paid back without checking, is it utilized for the right purposes? And there are a lot of stories, you can look them up, where funding was given to build a dam or a bridge. And then 10, 15 years later, somebody goes and checks and there's no bridge or there's no dam, right? How does this happen? And that goes back to governance. There needs to be a governance structure that makes sure you own the implementation. Here are some checkpoints at which we will check whether what this finance is supposed to go to is actually being implemented, so that we actually have that impact in the end, right? So, and again, it goes back to that perceived risk. So there's a perceived risk that there's higher corruption, so we can't give finance because it will be utilized for other things. Okay, but then whoever gives the finance maybe should check.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So these checkpoints, I think, need to be there, right? And then we can ensure that financing is actually going in the right direction and we achieve impact.
Yeah.
So the metric should then be not only is this money paid back, but has it achieved the impact it set out to? And currently that's not a metric that is there. Or maybe not, sometimes maybe, but not in all cases.
That needs to be brought to the forefront.
Yes.
And do you think that governance role should be global or local or regional?
I think it should be a mix. I think local communities should be empowered to do that, but they also need to know what they need to look at and how, right? So there might be maybe a handover period or something, right? Or other checkpoints in between. But I do think if whoever gives the finance cares about what this money is utilized for, then they also have a responsibility to ensure that this is followed through. But there has to definitely be an involvement of local communities. I'm not in favor for just outside people to be controlling and dictating everything in that sense. I think local communities also, it's a learning for them, right? They need to be upskilled to be able to manage those projects. So later on, they'll be able to handle them on their own.
And it goes back to long-term sustainability again.
Yes,
100%.
Yes.
I want to go back to when we were talking about corporate world and sustainability in corporate, and you mentioned like supply chains, and that's one way a company can make sure it's being sustainable, looking really deeply into their supply chain. What about companies that don't necessarily have a supply chain or don't necessarily have a direct impact on sustainability, something like the aviation industry or something like that? What about like a consulting firm? How can they be more sustainable?
I think consulting firms have a big responsibility to be sustainable. While we may think they don't have a supply chain, but they advise clients. So they do have a responsibility, right? And I think part of their work can actually be to drive these good decisions, right? These good behaviors as well. And to lead by example. I mean, a consulting firm, for example, if all their partners fly first class around the world every day, maybe not a good example for sustainability, right? But something to look at. I mean, I do think they can look at their own operations and see how they can be more sustainable. And this can also go back to like social values. Again, for me, sustainability at the core is about people. So what can they do to make life better for people as well?
I like that a lot. I like that a lot, what you
Yeah.
said. Because again, like we were saying earlier, sustainability, I think the way that it's being presented is always that it's an environmental thing. But and everybody says it, we should be more sustainable. But what does that actually mean? You know?
Exactly.
And especially for like even something I think about for companies that are not, you know, that don't have a direct impact on climate change, that aren't having huge carbon emissions, how can they be more sustainable? How can they contribute to a more sustainable world that includes much more beyond environmental metrics?
I mean, every company has a carbon footprint, right? It's
Yeah.
not like they don't have it, but some have a bigger one than another. But to be honest with you, if a company is actively reducing their emissions and their carbon footprint, but they don't pay their people on time, I find that that's a bit of a
Contradiction.
exactly, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so we need to look at all of that, right? Or they don't pay their suppliers on time. This is, by the way, something that I find really, for example, upsetting, because a lot of the bigger corporates that are looking at their sustainability framework and their strategy, and they're very much into all of these metrics, but then they don't pay their small suppliers on time, right? And their SMEs, and they're depending on cash flow to come in, right? That doesn't really align, right? So we need to look at all of those aspects, right? Going back to all of the aspects that fall within sustainability.
100%. I'm glad to see certain places, you know, making the move towards making this more of a priority. I think the UAE is one of them. That is a very good example.
Yeah.
I read a lot about it, and recently they've had a restructuring of their philanthropic team. And I think they're a good example of someone that puts philanthropy and impact as a priority.
And I think more and more here in the UAE, which I really appreciate, there's a real desire to look at impact.
Yes.
Because philanthropy is built into the culture, right? Philanthropy is built into the culture. But in the past, and you know this, right? In the past, philanthropy was done in a very Islamic way, that you don't talk about it, you do it, but you don't talk about it. And this, which I think is very noble. However, I believe we can achieve so much more when we can demonstrate the impact and then bring in more people who then also contribute, right? Because they see this is really impactful, right? And I do think this is something that the UAE does really well.
Phenomenally. No, and you can feel it, like you said. There's a culture of giving and impact, and you can really feel it here. It's very heartwarming.
And the same goes for food security.
Yes,
they've understood the importance and how critical it is, right? So
setting the example as always.
Yes, I mean we're blessed to be live in a country that actually gets it and understands it.
So grateful.
Yeah.
Grateful to see that example firsthand as well.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's the right place to be.
100%.
Yeah. Thank you.
Is there a better way to end the podcast than that?
No, it's perfect. It's perfect.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for today. I think we covered very important topics. We looked at the importance of financial inclusion, the importance of governance, the importance of accessibility, and how we can improve the structures that we already have, how we can push them to become better, what new structures we might need, what the future might look like. And I think we can go on forever and ever. But that's all that we have time for today.
Yes.
So thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you so much for this conversation. I enjoyed it very much, and I'm sure that our audience will as well.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you so much.
Sorry, we got carried away. We can talk about this forever, you know?